Hello, welcome.
Good morning.
Is St. John's Lutheran Church in Columbia, Pennsylvania. We are doing a book club type study of Walter Wangren's book, The Book of God, and we have reached to part 6, which is Letters from Exile. So the storyline, of course, is that the people of Israel got into trouble and were defeated by the Babylonians and carried off. And so I thought to clarify that a little bit, I'd pull up just the first paragraphs of an article on Wikipedia just to make it a political geographical kind of thing. Good luck with the names. So here's the deal. In the ancient Near East, if you can picture it on your map, the kind of crescent shape of the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt is the west and south civilization along the Nile. Up in the north and to the east is the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, which is kind of the cradle of civilization. The oldest ones that we know of, like Sumer and so forth, are from there. And what was happening in the ancient world was empires would come into existence and expand back and forth across this area that they called in French the Levant. So that's today Gaza, the Gaza Strip for the Palestinian Authority, Israel proper, and then to the north of that, Lebanon. A little bit inland, you have Jordan along the Jordan River and Syria. So that's the Levant. And the great empires would war with each other back and forth. So what brought the kingdom of Israel was united under Saul, David, Solomon. It fell apart back to its two sort of natural components of the 10 northern tribes, and then Judah, and I want to say Benjamin, but I haven't looked at that. And of course, the Levitical tribe is associated with the temple. So you have this rough division of the kingdom into two major parts that I would kind of liken to in the United States under the colonial period. There were 13 colonies. And then they fought the Brits together, and we had the Articles of Confederation, and then you started getting regions, like for example the South and the Middle Atlantic region and New England. These two divisions in ancient Israel were kind of like those regions. And in American history, we had a point in time where we had a constitutional convention and everybody merged, and it would be as if 80 years into it everybody goes and they went back to the Articles of Confederation. You know, that kind of a split. A common language, common religion, common culture, extensive economic trading, all those kinds of things, but politically couldn't get along. We may be heading toward that with the animosity in the country now, with the two coasts being extremely liberal and the middle part of the country not being that way. And I think in this last election, 80% of the counties in the country went for Trump and 20% went for Biden. And the 20% that went for Biden in terms of density of population was enough to have an 84 million vote tally versus a 74 million vote tally. So, you know, it's not geographical territory, it's where do the people live. And same thing here. So, in 721, under Tiglath-Pileser IV, there was the advance of the Assyrian Empire, and they came south and wiped out the northern 10 tribes. The kingdom of Samaria is what they called themselves, got in an alliance with a bunch of other little kingdoms to try to knock off the Assyrians, and they got destroyed. The Assyrians also came against Jerusalem and did not take the city. There was, we think, a coup d'etat back home, and the emperor and the army beat feet. They literally left all their stuff and headed back home in a hurry. And the empire hung on for a while. I used to think that was the end of it. They hung on for a while and fought the Babylonians for control, and the Babylonians took over. And in the year 605, there was a major battle between Babylon from the northeast against Egypt in the south and west, coming back and forth across the Levant. And Judah sided with Egypt, and Egypt lost. Like, according to the Babylonian records, in this battle in 605, the entire Egyptian army was killed to a man. So if you're Judah, it's like, the Norwegians have a word for that kind of a mistake. It's ufta, and this one kind of creeps up to the level of feed, which is really bad. So the punishment when you lose is you suck up to the new boss and you pay and tribute. Just like in Philly, it's protection money. So for 4 years, the king in Jerusalem, named Jehoiakim, paid tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. And then something happened in Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar's hold on the throne was pretty weak. So all of these little kingdoms stopped paying tribute, aligned together, and they thought, okay, here's our chance. They've got so much trouble at home that they can't mess with us, and by the time they come to mess with us, we'll be strong. And Nebuchadnezzar put it all back together again and came south, and you were going to pay the tribute with interest this time. So Nebuchadnezzar, in the 7th year, he came south. Jehoiakim died, and Jeconiah replaced him, and Jeconiah's successor was Zedekiah. So the Babylonians are collecting tribute and pulling people out, like political, the priests, if you were an artisan that could make money. So this is playing out over now 18 years. This exile is like a train wreck in super slow motion. And in Nebuchadnezzar's 23rd year, he dropped the hammer on him and started deporting people in large numbers back to areas around Babylon. And the idea was to decapitate the population so that the royal family and the aristocracy is gone, the priesthood is gone, the artisans are gone, anybody that raises up that looks like a rallying point for a population is either eliminated or carried off into captivity. So you have this building Jewish community near Babylon, and it's still corresponding with their people back in Jerusalem and Judea and so forth. And the deportations date 597, 587, 582, and the temple is destroyed in 587 on interestingly the same day of the year when the Romans destroyed the temple. It was the exact same day on the calendar. So anyway, they're all off in Babylon now, and the books in the Bible that have to do with this period of time, the two that are probably the single biggest blocks are Jeremiah and then Ezekiel. There is a slim possibility that Ezekiel is the biological son of Jeremiah. Got that from some rabbis, and It says that Ezekiel, the son of so-and-so, and it's not a real name. It's kind of the despised one kind of a name. And that's how they also referred to Jeremiah. So there's some rabbis that think it's a possibility that they're related to one another. They're certainly sympathetic to one another theologically. Jeremiah, interestingly, he was prophesying that the Babylonians were going to take Jerusalem and so forth. So in 601 there's this 3-month siege. In 598 Jehoiakim died during the siege, replaced by his son, then an 18-year-old. The city fell on March 16th in 597, and Nebuchadnezzar pillaged Jerusalem and the temple, and carried all these people off to Babylon, to include Ezekiel. Jeremiah predicted that this exile would last for 70 years, and turned out to be dead on, because 70 years later, under Cyrus the Great, the king of the Persians and the Medes, Babylon falls. And Cyrus is the one that starts saying, I want domestic tranquility here, so you're in exile. If you want to go home, you can, and I'll pay for it. And the Jews were in on that. They were given permission to go back. So that's the political situation. And there was, for a very brief time, a guy named Zerubbabel. If you ever do the walk through the Bible, it's like a one-day seminar, and you remember Zerubbabel found a pile of rubble. That's a little mental thing, but somewhere along the line, the Persians decided that having a hereditary aristocracy with the king in a far-flung corner of the empire was just not a great idea, and Zerubbabel disappears and probably killed. And that's when you get in Israel the political dominance of the priesthood. They're the next group that is a natural leadership body within the people of Israel. So when they get back, they start rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple, and that's where it's in the Hebrew Bible. It's one book, Ezra / Nehemiah. Our Bible makes it 2 books. So Ezra and Nehemiah and Chronicles 1 and 2, they're actually combined books, and they talk about this back in the city, back rebuilding the walls and so forth. And the hard part is the prophetic material in our Bible is arranged by length and positioned, like if you wrote more than the next guy, you go first, regardless of when you wrote. So that's a problem. You pick up your Bible and you go, I'm trying to read a coherent account of what happened, and the books are arranged by length, which immediately means you need to go to extra biblical resources. And in most Bibles, they'll have a page or 2 of explanatory information about the book to help you understand it. And 12 of the prophets are very short books that in the old days, the scrolls were about 33 feet long, and one prophet per scroll. Like Jeremiah gets his own scroll, Ezekiel gets his own scroll. The 12 so-called minor prophets all fit on one scroll. So not only are they arranged by relative length, but the littler ones are all on one scroll, and you really have to look at that introductory page to find out, okay, when did this guy write? Because it could be 700 years before Christ with the Assyrians, or 500 years before Christ with the Babylonians, or the return from exile. Where does it fit in? And obviously the circumstance informs your understanding of what you're reading, and it ain't easy. I bought a Bible, is an NIV translation of the Bible, on 3-ring 8.5 by 11 paper, and I got this big thick notebook with like 3-inch rings, and I put the books of the Bible in chronological order by book, just to help me try to keep it straight. And then I got tabs and put it in by epic, and so it's I went to all the trouble to do it, and I've never used it.
But as you were putting it together,
It's helping me to make sense of it.
Yeah.
If everybody, like, got hit in the head and voted me emperor of the world for the day, I would make them print the Bible as best they can in chronological order and redo the chapters and verses, because they don't make any sense at all. It's like, we have over the centuries figured out a way of putting words on paper by chapters and paragraphs and sentences and stuff. Well, the Hebrew was, all right, this is expensive, so no spaces between words. We don't need the vowels. You'll figure that out as you're reading along. So it's not what they call pointed. That, in fact, didn't get invented until 6 centuries into the Christian era. So you have these texts that you're looking at, and it's literally this continuous run of letters. And you've got to figure out, okay, this is a word, and this is a break. And then to, if that's not challenging enough, in Hebrew, the same characters are used for letters as numbers. So you're reading along, and the favorite one everybody knows is L'chaim, which is the number 18. So you're reading along, and it's like, is that life, or is it the number 18? And you have to tell from the context.
Yeah.
And numbers like 40 are a generation. So it literally means it started, it ran through the natural process and came to a conclusion. So is it Jesus was tempted for 40 days, or for a period of time until it was completed? And we're the ones that worry about which it is. They wouldn't have bothered to write it down that way if it was a problem for them. So, we bring our prejudices and problems with us to the text. So anyway, this destruction of the temple was horrific, extremely traumatic, and when they were given permission to go back, when you read Ezra and Nehemiah, not very many wanted to go back. I mean, if you were sitting there and for 70 years you got a house, your kids were married, your grandchildren were there, you started a business and it's working, and do you want to go back to a semi-arid desert surrounded by people that don't want you there, hate your guts, to a ruin of a city? They invented synagogues, they think, during the Babylonian captivity. It didn't exist beforehand, and they were everywhere afterwards, and the readings and the worship services are labeled, like we have the Old Testament lesson or the first lesson, they called them after the names of the sacrifices that were done during the day at the temple. So, like, even today, you drive around Lancaster and you have like Temple Bethel, or you can have a full, complete, safe, comfortable, emotionally, spiritually fulfilling relationship as a Jew in your faith community at your local synagogue. I went to one in Delaware one time, and it had an Olympic pool and a full gym and college classes and, just everything that you could possibly want in life is at your synagogue. Or you can pack up and go to the desert in Israel, surrounded by people that are trying to kill you morning, noon, and night, and start over from scratch. Who wants to go? That's the kind of situation that we're looking at, and that's where we've gotten in our novel. So I don't know if that helps in any way or not. So you loved it, or not?
There were parts that I got. I guess we start here in the beginning. It's actually the second part, where the Ahikim must make a decision, where we get into this thing about he gives his daughter up for the camel, and a couple more and more and more and everything else, and he thinks he's getting a tremendous deal until he actually sees the palace that this guy lives in and realizes that he could have gotten so much more. And I'm thinking, is that a parallel between of what God can actually offer or offers you as versus what you're willing to settle for? Will you settle for something much less because it looks like a lot to you? Is this the message or the lesson that I'm getting?
Okay. Trish, did you read any?
No. I would have if I would have realized, if I would have looked ahead and saw how quick a read that would have been right there.
Yeah. So here he is in Jerusalem on page 372. There is nearly no joy in homecoming. So as soon as we arrived, dry and weary, a priest named Yeshua, son of Jozadak, built an altar according to the law of Moses. We sacrificed in thanksgiving. We initiated all over again the burnt offerings morning and evening. We began to keep the appointed feasts of the Lord. So you have this Jewish population that has traveled several hundred miles to get there, and they're starting over. It's like there's no welcoming party. Nobody wanted them there. In Ezra and Nehemiah, it's so bad that they have to divide the force in half, and half of the people are dressed for battle and on guard, and the other half of the people are trying to dig, cut stone, and build with their weapons close at hand and swords strapped on and so forth. Jerusalem is desolate and unpopulated. Weeds have cracked the beautiful pavement, and where the temple used to be, wind travels unobstructed. People dragged its old stones away for their own purposes. So we began to quarry more stones to build a foundation for a new temple. Stonemasons dressed the great blocks and carved them on the temple site itself, fitting them into place. So, that's hammer and chisel work. We have not been able to pay our workers anything besides food, drink, and oil, might be olive oil. 2 years have passed since, with little rainfall, our crops failed. Sounds great, doesn't it?
Sounds awful.
And then the foundation was complete. Priests and vestments led us there in order to dedicate it. They blew trumpets as they processed. Levites followed with cymbals, praising the Lord. For he is good, for his steadfast love, they sang, endures forever toward Israel. So this is a real pioneer environment. And I think these three little chapters, letters from exile, are supposed to be, the quickest way as a transition in the book. Now we're home, he says. I have shown my son the grave where his grandfather Shaphan is buried. It is there that I wish also to be buried. Very soon Jeremiah, prophet of God, 2 or 3 days at most. In 3 days I will follow you down to darkness. Be gracious to the handful of Jews who must now rebuild a temple, a city, and a life. So what lessons do we learn from this exile? When I was at Dickinson, I was in Judaic Studies. Turned out to be a minor because I never learned the Hebrew, but the director of the program was Ned Rosenbaum, and he pointed out that the material that we have in the scriptures is written by a certain group of people within the tribe of Judah in the city of Jerusalem. So it's not exactly a objective, just passionate third person narrative of the thing. There it is. We're chapter 26. All right, so chapter 26 is what we're heading toward, but where everything in the next chapter, my messenger, is Malachi, which is the physically last book in the way that we print the Old Testament. And I have a friend who says the Italian prophet, and he pronounces it Malachi. Malachi means messenger, and it's a very significant. It's short, but it's very significant on two major topics. You see it. One of them is on the practice of tithing, and the other one is around the presence of John the Baptist appearing on the scenes. The idea of the one you seek will suddenly come to his temple, the messenger of the covenant, the Malachi, the Malachi of the covenant. And so, Handel brings it forward, and therefore Lutherans know it. But that's where we're headed next. Is you've got this remnant, I never say that word properly, that returns. And that's a major theme where it's a salvation issue, really, where, like for example, in Romans, Paul quotes, all have sinned, all have fallen short of the glory of God. There's none righteous, no, not even one. And yet, God will save a remnant and start over. And that is something that repeats itself. So maybe there's a remnant of Christians left in the ELCA. So this is a good transition point. What happens for the Jews once the exile is over and they're back in the land, the business of the prophetic ministry sort of peters out. There's a connection between prophets and kings, and when there's no king, there's no court, there's no prophetic ministry. So it's not that it ends completely, but there are some kind of winding down senses of the number of prophets and who they're trying to speak to the people. There is, in this return from exile period, we'll be getting to that as we read the next chapters, some things to look for is the old tried and true things that people used to go back to, like the covenant, the king, the land, and the idea was if every Jew would just live according to the covenant for one day, Messiah will come. I've heard that. And looking, well, maybe it's the king, maybe it's the land, maybe it's the covenant, maybe, and then you start picking up this form of prophecy called apocalyptic, where maybe this salvation that we're looking for isn't going to happen in time. It's going to be something that only God can fully bring about, and it will be outside of time as we know it. And you start picking up, for example, the prophet Daniel, a different kind of prophecy. Instead of him saying, like the Isaiah speaking about the Assyrians is, see that young woman over there? She's going to conceive and bear a child, and by the time that child's weaned, this will happen. So it's a in space, in time, right here, right now, with us. And then you get in Daniel, specifically chapter 7, you're going to start getting things of, in the night watches, I had a vision, and there was one who was the Ancient of Days, who comes and sits on a throne, and then there's one like a son of man that is presented to him, and he's given power and glory and dominion, and there's this heavenly image, and it's not, the reckoning of time is not, weaning is 2 years, pregnancy is 9 months, so within 3 years this is going to happen. And now this is a time, and a time and a half. What's a time?
Yeah. And with you saying about the prophecy, and with Ted mentioning about the daughter, you have this life of luxury.
Mm-hmm.
You have this choice. Life of luxury, what are you going to do? Or you're going to be living in poverty. And I almost feel like, with all the prophecy that goes on, they were just as confused as we are reading it.
Yeah.
I mean, they were. And then, I almost, you're saying, what's God doing? If God, we don't know, but I mean, he knew what he was doing, but then the Messiah was the answer to everything, and that's why God sent him. So we look at this and we're like, aha, that's what he was doing. It's almost,
yeah. We know looking backward, and they're trying to figure it out looking forward.
Right.
And then here we are in, the Christian theologians talk about, I think it's realized eschatology, like it's started, but it's not fully complete. It's already begun, but it's not yet completed. So here, where are we? We are in that time between the first fruits of the resurrection, Jesus, and the final resurrection. So we're living in that in-between time, and people like C.S. Lewis, he used the analogy from World War II when pretty much after the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans were spent militarily, and it was literally just a matter of time before, what's the thing in Star Trek with the Borg, resistance is futile. The Germans were fighting delaying actions, and in their worldview, they needed to do their duty and fight, and they in the West they would fight ferociously until they ran out of ammo, and then they'd surrender. And the Americans were going, dude, you need to think long term. You want us as the occupying power, or do you want the Soviets as the occupying power? If you don't want the Soviets, surrender now and stop making us fight all these stupid, pointless battles that you're going to lose anyway. And they were going, no, we have to do our duty. And it's a mopping up operation. And we're kind of in a period of the mopping up operation. Satan, you know, the devil and all his minions and so forth have been defeated by Jesus on the cross, and the ultimate outcome is beyond question at this point. But the mopping up operation is pretty deadly and protracted, and that's where we are in time, and trying to figure out, okay, what's the Lord calling me to do in my place in my time? And when it gets particularly sketchy, you start getting all kinds of, when I was in college, it was David Wilkerson with the late great Planet Earth. You guys are old enough to remember that. Came to Harrisburg to the Zimbo Mosque, and Teresa and I went to hear him, and you know, it's like gas going to $1 a gallon was a sign of the end times.
What's that mean for us now?
I think I read that, I think I read that book,
You probably did.
The Late Great Planet. I'd have to double check out there, but I think I did read that.
Well, it was very popular, and people were, you know, like, it's messed up here, Watergate, Vietnam, you know, it's a big anxiety, and so you get these Christians trying to think their way through what's God doing. More recently, there was the Left Behind series.
Left Behind, yeah.
Very popular. Once again, it's the
Yeah.
same thing of it's got to be the end. I think that starts out with this non-biblical concept of the rapture, and suddenly the stewardess and who's having an affair with the pilot, they're on this plane, and half the passengers are gone, and their clothes are there, and they're not anywhere, and they're trying to figure it out, and that's how the movie starts anyway. And that's the existence of those books is a way of trying to figure out in an ambiguous time, where are we, what's going on, where's all this headed, and so forth. And one of my professors joked around about, don't listen to anybody about the end times who's investing in real estate. So apparently Tim LaHaye and his partners were buying a lot of land. The best one, he may be dead now, but there was a professor at Harvard Divinity School named Harvey Cox that was this brilliant philosophical theologian kind of guy. And apparently in class one day, I got this from Tim Lull that I told you about earlier, somebody said, Dr. Cox, what is the rapture? Because it comes out of the Plymouth Brethren and the dispensationalist stuff. It's an interpretation of some things in Scripture, and of course they don't know Greek, so they got it wrong. But Cox said, the rapture is when you're standing there and you look out the window and you see these random people being pulled up into heaven, and your first thought is, well, I'll be damned. So that kind of speculation shows itself as a form of prophecy in the latter period of the biblical, the Hebrew Bible. And it's somewhat hopeful, because it says, like if you read the book of Revelation, at the end of it you go, all right, I don't get it, but God wins. And that's probably the point. But it happened as the return from exile was disappointing and difficult and so forth, in this looking for Messiah. If you're a Jew, you're not a Christian because you have decided that Jesus, Yeshua, can't be the Messiah because that's what you were told growing up. If you want to see a different story, one for Israel, they have a completely indigenous Israeli fundamentalist Christian ministry in Israel right now. It's really interesting. But the biblical period for the Jews kind of runs out of gas with the Romans, and it's like, what do we do now? And the Romans appeared on the scene in 63 BC. Pompey the Great walks into the Holy of Holies and decides that the Jews are a pathetic religion because they don't even have a statue of their God in their temple. And the Romans were invited in, and they stayed. And they just kept trying to run things through puppets, and they wanted the money, and they would leave you alone if you paid your taxes and didn't try to have a foreign policy. And things got worse and worse and worse. And there was a revolt in AD 66, one generation after Jesus. He said so. And the Romans came in, and they eliminated Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple, carried bunches of people off into what they called the diaspora, form of exile. The Jews tried again in 135 under a guy named Simeon Bar Kokhba, and this time the Romans came in and they just started up in the Galilee, and they filled all the wells, and they salted all the fields, and they killed everybody that was taller than the wheel on an ox cart, and who were old or whatever, babies, and everybody else was sold into slavery. It was a capital offense for a Jew to go near Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount was turned into a garbage dump, and the Jews did not get back into the land of Israel in any number until 1948.
It just seems like about every power that was in power at one time or another had just stomped these people into the ground, or spread them, scattered them all over creation.
They keep coming back.
And they are so resilient. Yeah.
And they're here, and they took a land that was totally desolate. And I mean, I've seen pictures of it as compared to some of the surrounding areas. And they've turned it into a garden spot. It's absolutely beautiful. And you look at this, and of course,
it's really hard to read the Hebrew scriptures about calling my children back from the corners of the earth and look at Israel and go, no, this is just a secular state. It's like, I don't think so. But with the point I'm trying to get at is Judaism without Jesus kind of peters out, and then it becomes something else after the second temple's destroyed. It becomes synagogue based and broken into, like there's Reformed and Conservative and Reconstruction and Orthodox, and then every one of those groups has lots of small groups and so forth, and they study the scriptures and have a Jewish life, but it's like a story that doesn't end properly. With Jesus, it comes to a climax, and then a whole new thing starts. The only two groups that survived the destruction of the Romans was the Pharisees, who become the rabbis, and that becomes rabbinical Judaism that we know, and Christianity, which very quickly becomes a Gentile thing. And the Gentiles, all the way up until the Council of Nicaea, there were more Jews in powerful positions around the Mediterranean than Christians. Christians were a pretty small, persecuted group until Constantine. And then after Constantine, the power differential shifts, and you start getting Christian anti-Semitism against Jews, and you have a long and sordid history there that nothing to be proud about. But
isn't that all tied in with the fact that for many, many years the Jews were the ones accused of killing Jesus? And
yeah,
that's where
I mean,
they placed that squarely on them.
if you want to get a mob going, and like a pogrom in Orthodox Russia or whatever, you get this thing going, the Christ killers. And
Yeah.
when the First Crusade was heading toward the Levant, they had rabble rousers. They're like, we don't have to go to the Middle East to kill infidels. There's some right here in Mainz. And they slaughtered them. They burned synagogues. There were a bunch of Jews that went into the bishop's palace, and he was trying to calm the crowd down, and they broke in and they killed all the people they could get their hands on, and the others committed suicide rather than be captured. And it is horrific stuff. And when you get to the 20th century with the Nazis, there's nothing new in their anti-Semitism other than the Nazis were particularly effective. So their system of persecution, and they had this thing called Kristallnacht, and it was supposed to be kind of like a one-time demonstration event, but they just ramped it up. They had a conference in Berlin and came up with the final solution, and were systematically doing what had previously been sort of spot riots and crimes of passion, if you will, as opposed to premeditated slaughter. And that kind of xenophobia is human history, unfortunately. But where we are, you have this group who go back into the land and restart. And the way he breaks this out is Malachi, Ezra, and then that will bring the Old Testament portion of this novel to its conclusion. So I think that's what we'll do, is this part 6, the yearning, or I'm sorry, part 7. And then that will take us to where he breaks to the New Testament. So we're going to do part 7.
Okay.
Which will get you Ezra primarily and Malachi. And Nehemiah also. Ezra and Nehemiah were Jews that were born in Babylon in the exile, that were officials in the government, and they were able to use their positions back in with the Persian authorities to orchestrate the return and getting resources to rebuild the city and the temple and so forth. But anyway, the Old Testament biblical period kind of ends with Ezra and Nehemiah. There's some fun things in the Bible. When they returned, one of the things that they were very concerned about was racial purity. And the fledgling government in Jerusalem literally made people get rid of their foreign wives and children.
I was going to say, how could they do that with all those concubines?
With all those what?
Am I saying it incorrect? Concubines?
Oh, concubines, yeah. But anyway, it was get rid of your foreign wives and children, and you're a Jew, marry a Jew. The word Jew, by the way, comes from Judean, and in the Persian government, Judah was a province within the satrap of beyond the river. And so if you were from Judah, you were a Jew. And that's where that word gets played. Prior to the Persians, it's probably easier to say Israelite. But anyway, there is a book that is in the Bible called Ruth. And the point of the book of Ruth is that the great, iconic king of Israel, David, his great-grandmother was a Moabite. So you are a Jew if your mother or your grandmother's a Jew, ethnically. So in this time where it's get rid of your foreign wives, this story is brought forward, and Ruth is a Moabite married to a guy from Judah, from Bethlehem, and he dies, and her brother-in-law dies, and her father-in-law is dead, and Naomi, the mother-in-law, wants the girls to go back to their families. The one does, and Ruth says, "Where you go, I'll go." There's lots of people that have put that in their wedding rings, and it was really daughter-in-law to mother-in-law. I had a friend that was a missionary in Japan, and he said he was doing great with this sort of college young professional group, and then he said his wife taught a Bible study on Ruth, and all these Japanese women were like not interested in your religion, because in the Japanese culture, you go into your husband's house, and daughter-in-law to mother-in-law is not always a fun relationship. And these girls were like, "No, not interested, thank you." And the point of the story, though, is the great King David, there's nobody that's more Jewish than him, is not a purebred. And that surfaces while they're get rid of your foreign wives. So there's debate within the library of the Bible, so that'll show itself. But if we do this section, that'll carry us to the end of the biblical Old Testament, then we'll start into the New Testament. So I think he does a pretty good job of making it approachable. You could do a lot of boring history to get the same thing.